Of the 153 destroyers the Royal Navy lost during the Second World War, 72 sank in a single theater in less than 3 years. It was not the North Atlantic, not the Pacific, but the Mediterranean. This body of water stretched 2,300 kilometers in length and never more than 1,000 kilometers wide, surrounded by enemy air bases and riddled with submarine patrol zones. Italian naval forces and the Luftwaffe operated from Sicily, while the Regia Aeronautica flew from Sardinia. German surface units struck from every occupied port between Toulon and Tripoli. The Mediterranean consumed Royal Navy destroyers at a rate unmatched by any other theater, because it was the arena where Britain had the least margin. The supply line to Malta ran through waters the enemy could reach from every direction. The evacuation of Crete demanded ships to enter zones dominated entirely by shore-based aircraft. Operational demands never paused long enough for the force to rebuild what previous weeks had cost. The Admiralty termed the Mediterranean the vital theater. The men who served there called it many things, none appearing in official records. Losses were concentrated, but the service itself stretched across every ocean the war opened, imposing extreme conditions on those who served. Admiralty language spoke of shields of the fleet and senior service, traditions not designed to describe what the men actually endured. A Royal Navy destroyer rating in 1941 earned approximately £2 and 5 shillings per month. He slept in a hammock slung from hooks above the mess table, rolled in a net. At Réveillé, he ate meals prepared from raw provisions in a mess of 15 men sharing one table in the surrounding space for every daily activity. Bathing depended on the ship's water allocation, which was not always sufficient. He stood watches in weather dictated by operational necessity, whether winter in the North Atlantic or every season in the Mediterranean. This was the service the Admiralty defined. The men's letters home, censored before transmission, described it differently. The destroyer fleet of 1939 was not uniform. The gap between the newest, most capable vessels and the oldest still in commission was wide. Serving on a tribal-class destroyer and serving on a V-class ship from the First World War were experiences worlds apart. The tribal-class destroyer displaced 1,870 tons at standard load and 2,519 tons fully equipped for war. It measured 377 feet from stem to stern and 36.5 feet at the beam. Its main armament consisted of 8 4.7-inch guns and 4 twin mounts, supplemented by 4 21-inch torpedo tubes in a single quadruple mount. Twin Parsons geared turbines produced 44,000 shaft horsepower, driving the ship to a designed maximum speed of 36 knots. At 36.5 knots, she was by any contemporary measure a capable and formidable warship. The Royal Navy commissioned 16 tribal-class destroyers between 1938 and 1939. Of these 16, 12 were sunk during the war, a destruction rate of 75% for the class that represented the pinnacle of British destroyer design. At the start of the conflict, the V and W class destroyers that filled out the fleet were older by 15 to 20 years and smaller by a significant margin. AV class displaced approximately 1,490 tons, measured 312 feet, and could make 34 knots in her trial condition of 1918, a condition altered by 2 decades of service, 2 refits, and the accelerated maintenance cycles of wartime operations, changes noted increasingly in operational readiness reports. These ships formed the majority of the escort force in 1939 and 1940, running Atlantic convoys, channel patrols, and Norwegian operations, sent wherever the fleet required a destroyer. The forward mess deck on a V-class destroyer was the primary living space for 40 to 50 junior ratings, the seamen, stokers, electrical artificers, ASDIC operators, and torpedo men, who formed the bulk of the crew. It occupied a space in the bow below the main deck, roughly 30 feet long and 16 feet wide at its widest point, tapering toward the stem. In this space were the mess tables, mess lockers holding food stores, and hammock hooks fitted to the deckhead as naval regulations required. The 40 or so men living there relied on the hammock system maintained throughout the Second World War. Regulation hammocks were stowed, rolled in nets above the main deck by day and slung from hooks below the deckhead at night. It was not an antiquated tradition, but a practical solution to a space problem. A hammock occupied deck space only when in use, unlike a fixed bunk, which permanently occupied the space. On a V-class destroyer with 40 men, this difference determined whether the mess deck was livable during the day. Sleeping in a hammock slung 18 inches from the man above and 12 inches from the man beside on a North Atlantic passage in force 7 conditions, with the bow pitching through 12-foot swells that amplified the hammock's pendulum motion, was a physical challenge beyond theoretical reasoning. The bow compartment was the worst place on a destroyer at sea, experiencing the greatest motion and vertical acceleration. Junior ratings were positioned there because seniority moved higher-ranking men aft to calmer berths. A man aboard for 2 years slept in calmer water than one who had joined 3 months prior. The hierarchy was real, and its effect measurable in sleep quality. Sleep on a Royal Navy destroyer in the North Atlantic was not rest in any peacetime sense. Watches rotated in 4-hour on, 8-hour off periods, which meant that 8 theoretical hours off watch were staggered across day and night. These hours were further reduced by meal preparation, maintenance that could not wait for port, mandatory damage control drills, and general quarters alarms generated by contested waters. In 1941, a destroyer escorting a convoy from Halifax to Liverpool averaged between 90 minutes and 3 hours of uninterrupted sleep per 24-hour period during sustained U-boat contact. ASDIC operator detections repeatedly brought the ship to action stations, as darkness was the submarine's primary tactical protection. Studies by the Royal Navy's Institute of Aviation Medicine, extended to surface warfare by 1943, documented these sleep figures against physiological standards for sustained performance, concluding the operational tempo made it impossible to fully act on the men's needs. They continued anyway because convoys had to reach port, and the escort had to provide protection. The specific physical conditions imposed by the North Atlantic over 5.5 years of convoy escort and fleet operations require careful consideration. The North Atlantic was the primary environment for the largest portion of the Royal Navy's destroyer force, producing sustained physical hardship unmatched in any other theater. Winter storms regularly reached gale force 8 and above on the Beaufort scale, with wind speeds between 34 and 40 knots, and wave heights averaging 6 to 8 meters, individual waves exceeding 11 meters for days at a time. A destroyer of 1,490 tons displacement was not stable, spending significant fractions of every hour beyond designed operational limits, while crews managed equipment and watches on a deck simultaneously pitching, rolling, and yawing. Ship stabilizers, fitted on some classes, reduced but did not eliminate the effects. Commanding officers consistently reported candidly that ships were wet. Operational reports used this term to measure water coming aboard over the bow and main deck, finding its way through imperfect seals into the wheelhouse and forward mess, soaking hammocks as the bow struck waves. By the time the forward mess was running in force 8, it was not dry. Wetness varied between damp and soaked until everything reached maximum saturation. Adaptation meant ceasing to care about being wet. Food for destroyer ratings followed the same mess cook system as battleships, but the ship's constant motion constrained what could be prepared and stored without spoiling. The Galleon V-class destroyer was a single space, feeding the entire crew through multiple sittings, managed by a cook who prepared hot meals under physical challenges far beyond moderate conditions. Hot food in Force 8 was an achievement. Often it remained theoretical, and men ate whatever could be prepared, braced in whatever position they could manage. The Royal Navy's destroyer service in the North Atlantic cannot be measured by a single battle. It is captured in a 3-night period in March 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic's critical climax, when convoy HX-229 and convoy SC-122 were simultaneously attacked by 40 U-boats, losing 21 merchant ships totaling 141,000 tons. The escorts defending both convoys included destroyers whose crews had been at sea for periods, documented in the watch logs, without describing HMS Volunteer, an ex-American stoker transferred under the 1940 agreement, serving as escort commander for HX-229 during the worst night of the attack. She had been at sea for 11 days when the main U-boat attack developed on the night of March 16th. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Gordon Luther, directed the escort's response to multiple simultaneous submarine contacts through a night that the action report describes in clipped official language: bearings, times, depth charge patterns, course changes, without capturing the bridge conditions, the temperature, the sea state, or the condition of the men who had been managing the ship in watches through 11 North Atlantic days. Volunteer sank 1 U-boat during the operation, but lost 4 merchant ships from the convoy she was escorting. The arithmetic of that night, the end of the HX-229 and SC-122 battle, was read by Admiral Dönitz as his force's greatest success of the war, and by the Admiralty as the closest the Battle of the Atlantic came to being lost. The men on the escorts read it as the night when everything they did proved insufficient for what was happening around them. 3 months later, in May 1943, improved convoy escort tactics, increased air cover from very long-range aircraft, new anti-submarine weapons, and the intelligence advantage Bletchley Park's Enigma decryption provided, combined to shift the battle's arithmetic decisively. In May 1943 alone, 41 U-boats were sunk, and Dönitz withdrew the main U-boat force from the North Atlantic. The crisis passed, yet the men who had been on escorts through the crisis years, 1941, 1942, and the first quarter of 1943, did not receive official acknowledgement addressing what the transition had cost them specifically. The strategic situation had improved, but operational requirements continued. As U-boats operated in reduced numbers, convoys still needed escort, and watch rotations continued. One specific incident that reaches to the center of what Royal Navy destroyer service cost in human terms is HMS Harvester on the night of March 11, 1943, 3 days before HX-229 reached its climax. Harvester was an H-class destroyer commissioned in 1939. 1,340 tons, 323 feet long, armed with four 4.7-inch guns and 8 torpedo tubes, with a crew of approximately 175 men. She had been running North Atlantic convoy escort since 1940. On March 11, 1943, she was the senior escort with convoy HX-228 when she gained an ASDIC contact and began a depth charge attack on U-432. The first attack brought U-432 to the surface. Harvester's commanding officer, Commander A. Tate, closed in, striking U-432, which rolled under and the German submarine sank. In the collision, Harvester's bow was damaged and her port propeller shaft fouled by wreckage from U-432. She lost speed and lay stopped in the North Atlantic while her engineering department attempted to clear the shaft and restore propulsion. At approximately 10:07 on March 11th, the German submarine U-444, observing the engagement, torpedoed the stationary Harvester. The explosion in the engine room broke the ship in two within minutes. Both sections sank. The Free French corvette Aconit arrived shortly after, sank a U-444, and began rescue operations, recovering 61 survivors from Harvester's crew. Commander Tate was not among them. Out of approximately 175 men, 114 were lost. The men who went into the North Atlantic on March 11, 1943, from a ship stopped in a U-boat operating area after a ramming action, entered water at approximately 7 degrees Celsius. At 7 degrees, survival without a suit, which was not standard for destroyer crews in 1943, ranged between 30 and 90 minutes, depending on individual condition and circumstances. Aconit's arrival brought rescue within the survival window for some. For others, 30 minutes had already passed. The names of those who died are recorded in the Commonwealth War Graves Commission casualty lists, with ages and service numbers. What is not recorded is what 7 degrees Celsius feels like after 30 minutes, or the cost of holding a shipmate's head above water while awaiting a corvette, or the experience of being recovered and reassigned to another escort vessel sailing on its next convoy in 48 hours. The survivor who sailed 48 hours later performed the function the Royal Navy required in the physiological and psychological condition left by 30 minutes in the North Atlantic after watching his ship break in two. There was no alternative assignment. Convoys had to cross. The Battle of the Atlantic required what it required. The hearing damage from sustained destroyer operations, from 4.7-inch guns and depth charge explosions, was universal among destroyer veterans. The guns in twin mountings produced muzzle blast overpressure, permitted by gunnery specifications, but not by medical standards for safe exposure. Crews fired without adequate hearing protection because tactical verbal communication made protection incompatible with duty. Hearing loss occurred incrementally, noticed only when the noise ceased. Cold injury in older ships without adequate heating appeared in post-war health records. Peripheral cold injury was routinely recognized without individual proof. Post-war surveys recorded battle fatigue, described by men in specific sounds and sensations that did not leave one survivor, Seaman William Dodds of HMS Harvester, who was 23 from Sunderland, County Durham. On the night of March 11, 1943, Dodds was part of Harvester's ASDIC team, below decks when U-444 torpedo struck. The engine room explosion produced a shock he described in a welfare interview at Liverpool Naval Hospital on March 15, 1943, one of the rare formal assessments conducted before reassignment. The shock was different from a depth charge, originating inside rather than outside. Dodds was in the water for approximately 25 minutes before Aconit reached him. The water temperature was 7 degrees Celsius. He was hypothermic when recovered and treated for 4 days. The welfare officer noted he appeared physically recovered, alert, responsive, with no obvious acute psychological disturbance, and recommended reassignment after a minimum of 2 weeks shore leave. Dodds received 4 days and served on 2 subsequent destroyers through the rest of the war, completing Atlantic and Arctic convoy operations. After the war, he returned to Sunderland, working 34 years in the shipyards on the Ware-building peacetime ships. He retired in 1979 and died in 1994 at 74. His daughter, in an account deposited with Sunderland Local Studies Library in 2003, described her father as a man who worked with ships his whole life without comfort on water. She said he treated the river with attention but without warmth, a complicated history. After his death, she found a small notebook with 2 entries. The first, dated March 16, 1943, listed the 114 men from Harvester who had not been recovered. The second, dated August 15, 1945, simply read, "These are the ones who did not come home from the same ship I came home from." He kept it for 49 years. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.